On the evening of November 6, 1951, in a house in Philadelphia, Ava Gardner opened a letter that had arrived for her in the mail. She was due to marry Frank Sinatra the following day. The letter was from a woman who worked in the sex trade, claiming she had been sleeping with Sinatra for months, all the way through the engagement, and that Ava had no idea. Ava had every idea what Frank Sinatra was. She married him anyway less than 24 hours later in a private ceremony at a friend's house in Germantown, Pennsylvania, 72 hours after his divorce from his first wife had even been finalized, 6 years earlier, before either of them had said a word to each other. Sinatra had looked at a magazine cover with Ava Gardner's photograph on it and told a friend flatly that he was going to marry that girl. He was already married when he said it. He was still married to the same woman when he finally got his wish. In between those two moments sat a courtship that included a shootout in a small desert town, a sunk boat on Lake Tahoe, at least 3 separate suicide attempts, 2 abortions neither of them discussed publicly for decades, and a role reversal in which the actress ended up bankrolling the singer's career at the exact moment he needed it most. Both of them, separately, later called the other the love of their life. Neither of them, together, could stand to be in the same room for very long without something breaking. Stay with me, and I'll walk you through exactly how those two facts fit inside the same 6 years. To understand how two people this famous ended up this incapable of leaving each other alone, you have to go back to 2 very different starts. One in rural poverty, one in a working-class immigrant household a few hundred miles north, and to the first wife who watched the whole thing happen from the outside. And before we move forward, please subscribe and comment from where you are watching this. Now coming back, Ava Gardner was born in 1922 in Grabtown, North Carolina, the youngest of 7 children of a tobacco farmer who lost the family land when Ava was small and spent the rest of his life sharecropping other men's fields. He died when she was 16. She was training to become a secretary when a photograph her brother-in-law took of her found its way to an MGM talent scout. And within a couple of years, she was married to Mickey Rooney, the biggest box office star in America at the time, a marriage that lasted barely a year before he left her. A second marriage to bandleader Artie Shaw ended almost as fast, with Shaw leaving her within roughly a year of the wedding, by her own later account to her memoir's ghostwriter. The divorce from Shaw broke her heart in a way Rooney's never had. By the time Ava Gardner met Frank Sinatra properly, she had already survived 2 failed marriages before turning 25, and what she actually wanted out of any relationship, by her own later telling, was something considerably quieter than what Hollywood kept handing her: a stable home, not another headline. Frank Sinatra came from Hoboken, New Jersey, the only child of an Italian immigrant boxer turned fireman, and a mother locally known for her political connections and her temper. He married his high school sweetheart, Nancy Barbato, in 1939, in a modest ceremony that led to an equally modest life at first, an apartment in Jersey City. Nancy working as a secretary while Frank sang for tips as a singing waiter before the fame arrived. By the time he crossed paths with Ava Gardner, he and Nancy had 2, and eventually 3, young children, and he was already the most famous singer in America, filling concert halls with teenage girls who screamed loudly enough that newspapers coined a word for the sound. Fame, in his case, arrived well before any particular interest in being an ordinary husband stuck around to match it. Nancy Barbato knew about his affairs for years, by her own later admission, and chose, for a long time, to look the other way. There was a third woman in this story almost from the beginning, and she never once appeared on a movie poster. Sinatra's mother, Dolly, ran her son's personal life with the same force she'd once run ward politics in Hoboken. And by most accounts, she never warmed to Ava Gardner the way she'd expected a daughter-in-law to eventually win her over. Dolly had liked Nancy Barbato, an Italian girl from the neighborhood who fit the picture Dolly had always held of her son's life. Ava fit no picture Dolly had ever imagined, and friends of the family later described a mother-in-law who made her disapproval known in exactly the blunt, unfiltered way she made every other opinion known. Sinatra, a man who by then commanded concert halls and studio executives without much difficulty, never fully worked out how to manage his own mother's opinion of his second wife, and the tension between the two women simmered, largely unresolved, for the length of the marriage. So when these two people actually met, neither one was remotely equipped to want a small, uncomplicated life. One of them was already spoken for, with a wife at home who'd already decided not to see what she didn't want to see, and the other was about to marry into a household where the groom's own mother had already made up her mind against her. Sinatra first spotted Ava Gardner in 1942 at the Macombo nightclub on the Sunset Strip while she was still married to Mickey Rooney. He made his way through the crowd afterward and told her, more or less as a joke, that if he'd met her before Rooney had, he would have married her himself. She brushed it off. She knew exactly what he was, a married man with a considerable reputation, and she wasn't interested in adding herself to his list. For the next several years. That was more or less where things sat, Sinatra fully aware of her, Gardner entirely unmoved, both of them still married to other people. By 1948, that had changed. Sinatra ran into Gardner again and asked her to dinner, and this time something took. The two of them began spending real time together, despite MGM studio head Louis B. Mayer personally warning Gardner off dating a married man whose career the studio didn't need attached to a scandal. Sinatra, for his part, kept putting off the one conversation that would have made any of it simpler, asking his wife for a divorce. Nancy Barbato refused for as long as she reasonably could. She later admitted, in an interview years afterward, that the period drove her husband to what she called the edge of suicide, and she wasn't wrong. Only once the affair became genuinely impossible to keep out of the papers did Nancy finally agree to end the marriage. In 1951, on financial terms Sinatra's own biographers describe as remarkably generous to her, a lifetime share of his future earnings negotiated by most accounts, because he was desperate enough by that point to agree to nearly anything to get free. The public did not treat the affair kindly, and neither for a while did Sinatra's career. Word of the affair broke wide open in the years just before the divorce, and the backlash landed almost entirely on Sinatra rather than on Gardner. Hate mail poured into the studio by the sack. Radio stations reportedly pulled his records. The Catholic Church weighed in publicly against him. Gardner, by contrast, barely lost a step. Her established screen persona as a man eating femme fatale meant the scandal read as consistent with her image rather than a betrayal of it, and her films kept selling. Sinatra's did not. His voice itself was failing him around the same time. His record label dropped his contract, and for the first time since he'd become famous, film and radio offers simply stopped coming. Friends who knew him during this stretch said he told Gardner directly that she was all he had left to want. She wanted more than he was able to give her calmly. And the pattern that would define the marriage was already visible before the wedding had even happened. The courtship itself, in the 2 years before the ceremony, was less a romance than a preview of everything the marriage would eventually become, and it very nearly ended more than once before it started. In 1950, the two of them, both still legally married to other people, spent a drunken night driving from Palm Springs out to the small desert town of Indio, California, where Sinatra started firing a handgun at streetlights for fun, and Gardner, matching him, shot out the window of a hardware store. Local police arrested them both. Gardner's studio quietly paid to make the incident disappear before it reached the papers. A year later, over Labor Day weekend of 1951, while both of them were sitting out separate residency periods in Reno to finalize their respective divorces, they took a boat out onto Lake Tahoe at the Cal Neva Resort. Gardner told Sinatra, mid-outing, that she'd recently had an affair with a co-star. Sinatra flew into a rage so severe that his own business manager, who was piloting the boat, lost control of it and ran it aground, tearing open the hull. That same night, Sinatra swallowed an overdose of sleeping pills. His valet found him in time and called a doctor, who most biographers agree saved his life. 8 days later, the two of them were married in Germantown. That was the courtship. The marriage that followed didn't calm down. If anything, it escalated. Both of them were, by nearly every account from people who knew them, ferociously jealous and completely unable to hide it, and the fights that resulted from that jealousy were not private in any meaningful sense. Sinatra grew so obsessed with the idea that the aviation magnate Howard Hughes was pursuing Gardner that he reportedly threatened more than once to kill him. During one legendary blow-up, described by biographer Lee Server, Sinatra hurled a water-filled douchebag at Gardner and her friend Lana Turner in the middle of an argument. One mutual friend described simply being around the couple as similar to sitting on cracked eggs, since nobody present ever knew when the next set of verbal daggers was coming, or when a piece of furniture might follow them. Neither one confined the jealousy to hypotheticals, and neither one was faithful to the other for very long. Gardner, despite once telling a reporter she hated cheating and wouldn't tolerate it, had at least 2 affairs of her own during the marriage, with the Spanish bullfighters Mario Cabr and Luis Miguel Domingon, the second of which she confessed to Sinatra directly on that boat at Lake Tahoe, with the results already described. Sinatra's own reputation for straying from the marriage was, by that point, already a matter of public record rather than speculation. Both of them, in other words, spent the marriage accusing the other of exactly the thing each of them was also doing. And at least 3 separate times during the relationship, Sinatra responded to the accusations: the jealousy, or simply the despair of loving her by trying to end his own life, once by gas alone in a New York apartment, saved only because a friend happened to find him, once by pills after the Tahoe boating incident, and once, according to his own longtime valet George Jacobs, by walking into their bedroom holding a loaded gun to his head, at which point Gardner physically wrestled the weapon away from him. The gun discharged during the struggle. The bullet missed them both. Underneath all of that noise sat a private wound that never made it into any of the tabloid coverage at the time. And it was compounded by the machinery of the studio system itself, which had its own financial stake in what Ava Gardner was allowed to do with her own body. Ava Gardner had 2 abortions during the marriage, a fact she confirmed publicly herself years later in her own memoir. The first came in 1952 while she was in Nairobi filming Mogambo opposite Clark Gable and Grace Kelly, a production Sinatra had traveled to Africa specifically to be near her for, uninvited by the studio and, by some accounts, not entirely welcomed by the production itself. He had no role in the film and no particular reason to be on location in Kenya other than Ava. And he spent weeks in Nairobi hotels and rented houses with essentially nothing to do while his wife worked 12-hour days in the heat on a shoot everyone involved already understood was partly about adultery on screen and partly off screen about the very real thing happening inside his own marriage. The tabloids covering the production couldn't resist the parallel, a film about a love triangle in the African bush, shot by a cast that included a husband hovering at the edges of someone else's workplace, jealous and unemployed, while his wife carried the household. She became pregnant during the shoot and terminated the pregnancy after Sinatra had already left the location, without telling him what she'd decided until it was already done. By multiple biographers' accounts, MGM's own contract structure factored directly into the decision. The studio held financial penalty clauses against its female stars for pregnancy and arranged Gardner's travel for the procedure itself. When Sinatra found out afterward, he was reportedly devastated. The 2 of them tried again to make the marriage work, and Gardner became pregnant a second time. She chose to end that pregnancy as well, for largely the same tangle of reasons: a marriage she didn't trust to hold together, and a studio contract that made motherhood a professional liability. Neither of them discussed any of it with the public while it was happening. It surfaced only decades later in the same careful, after-the-fact way most of this marriage's real damage tended to surface, long after anyone could do anything about it. While all of that was happening privately, something almost as strange was happening to their finances and their careers in full public view. For most of the marriage, Ava Gardner was the star, and Frank Sinatra was, by his own account, essentially broke. Gardner was earning as much as $140,000 for a single picture during these years. while Sinatra's contract with MGM had been terminated and his club bookings had thinned out to almost nothing. He was, by Gardner's own later description to a reporter, flat broke when they married, so short on cash that when he bought her gifts, the bill reportedly went onto her own account rather than his. She had a clause written into one of her own contracts obligating her studio to find him work, and she personally lobbied a producer to give him a screen test for a supporting role in a war drama called From Here to Eternity. He got the part. It won him the Academy Award in 1954 and relaunched a career that had been circling the drain for the better part of 3 years, engineered. In no small part, by the wife he was already in the process of losing. Because by the time that Oscar was actually in his hands, the marriage that had made the comeback possible was already finished in every way that mattered. MGM announced the couple's separation in 1953, and the year that followed was, by every account, the darkest of Sinatra's adult life to that point. Gardner, for her part, left the country. She settled in Madrid, continued the affairs with Cabar and later Domingan, and by her own later admission to her memoir's ghostwriter, she wasn't especially surprised the marriage had collapsed as fast as it had, she told him plainly, decades afterward, that she was more surprised it had lasted as long as it did. The divorce wasn't finalized until 1957, 4 years after MGM's separation announcement, the paperwork trailing the actual end of the marriage by nearly as long as the marriage itself had lasted. And then, having spent 6 years unable to build a life together, they spent the next 33 years unable to fully let each other go, even as both of them, on paper, moved on. Sinatra did not stay unmarried for long in the years that followed, though nothing that came after ever quite matched what Ava had been. In 1966, he married the actress Mia Farrow, 30 years his junior, a marriage that lasted barely 2 years before ending in divorce. A decade later, in 1976, he married Barbara Marx, a marriage that would last for the rest of his life. Gardner, by contrast, never remarried after Sinatra at all. 3 marriages behind her before the age of 35, and none in front of her for the following 33 years. She moved first to Madrid, then permanently to London in 1968, largely out of reach of the American press that had covered every fight of her marriage in detail. Sinatra, for his part, kept a photograph of her taped to his dressing room mirror for years afterward, wherever he happened to be performing, through both of the marriages that came after hers. His daughter Tina later said publicly that Ava's eventual death hit her father with a private grief he never once shared with anyone, however he presented himself in public, and that the pain he actually carried ran far deeper than anything he let show. Gardner, for her own part, told the actress Arlene Dahl in later years that Sinatra had been the only real love of her entire life. In 1966, reflecting on the choices behind all 3 of her marriages, Gardner admitted to a reporter that she wished, now, she'd had the things that mattered more to a woman than a career: a good marriage, children, a proper education. In 1982, asked again by a London paper, she said much the same thing, that she would have traded the career for one marriage that actually lasted. The last chapter of that connection played out in a hospital room, not a nightclub. And by then, the man who'd once fired a gun at a streetlight because he loved her too loudly was quietly paying her bills instead. Gardner suffered the first of 2 strokes in 1986, which left her partially paralyzed and largely confined to her London flat for the rest of her life. Sinatra called her hospital room after the stroke, and later, when her own considerable savings from decades of film work started running down against the cost of her care, he quietly picked up her medical bills himself, by some accounts as much as $50,000, despite the fact that neither of them had been married to the other in over 3 decades, and despite the fact that he had a living wife of his own at the time. She died of pneumonia in London on January 25, 1990, at 67. Sinatra was, by every account from people close to him, devastated in a way he kept almost entirely private, the same way he'd kept nearly everything about her private for 33 years once the marriage itself was over. Lay the whole thing out as a ledger, and the asymmetry runs in an unusual direction for a story like this one. It wasn't the husband who rescued the wife's career, the way these stories so often go. It was Ava Gardner, at the height of her own fame and largely bankrolling the marriage herself, who got Frank Sinatra back in front of a camera at the exact moment his own industry had written him off. And she was gone from his life by any legal definition before the Oscar he won for it ever reached his hands. The film that resurrected his career premiered while the two of them were already separated. He built the rest of his career, the Rat Pack years, the Vegas residencies, the second act that made him a legend rather than a footnote. Standing on a foundation the woman he couldn't stay married to had built for him on her way out the door. Within a handful of years of the divorce, he was headlining the Sands with Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., palling around with a sitting president's brother-in-law, and commanding fees that made the broke, unbookable version of himself from 1952 almost unrecognizable. Every profile written about that comeback in the decades since credits the Oscar, the reinvention, the sheer will Sinatra brought back to the work. Almost none of them lead with the fact that the screen test behind all of it was a favor called in by a wife who was already by then planning her exit. He married twice more after her, and each time by his own daughter's account. Some part of him stayed exactly where it had been in 1957. Go back to that letter one more time, the one that arrived at Ava Gardner's door the night before her wedding, telling her exactly who she was about to marry. She read it, and she married him the next morning anyway, and everything that letter warned her about turned out to be true for the following 6 years, and in its way, for the following 33 after that. Frank Sinatra spent the rest of his life keeping her photograph on his mirror through 2 more marriages and a career that never stopped growing. Ava Gardner spent the rest of hers telling people he was the only one who'd ever really counted, in a London flat 3,000 miles from the man paying for the nurse in the next room. Neither fact ever canceled the other one out. In this particular marriage, they never did. R. Let me know in the comments where you're watching this from and what you thought of their story. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.